Hi everybody, I'm Chris Yaw. Welcome to ChurchNext. This is a place where energetic leaders come to hear from experienced mentors, from people who are doing a bang-up job building healthy congregations. Very soon the United States will no longer have, as its majority, European Americans. We're truly becoming a melting pot thanks to an influx of new faces, many of them Latino. What are churches doing about it? How can churches welcome new people? To what is Christ calling us to do to prepare? Well, Disciples of Christ executive José Morales often gets asked that question. And José, let's start right there. Welcome to ChurchNext. Could you begin by telling us some of the positive stories regarding the room churches are making for new faces?
Sure. Thank you, Chris, for having me. I really think the influx of what I'm calling immigrant faith is sparking the mainline evangelicals, Pentecostals, all these sort of streams of Protestantism and even Catholicism with a fresh boost of renewed faith. Years ago, Harvey Cox wrote a book about how we were going secular. Yeah. And he recently wrote another book called, I think, Fire from Heaven, about the charismatic revival, and realized that he was wrong. That, in fact, this immigrant faith, which has caught sort of fire in the two-thirds world, is now coming back here. Yeah. And now you hear about Korean churches sending missionaries to the U.S. Yeah. You hear about indigenous, self-theologizing, self-sustaining, self-governing denominations sending missionaries to the U.S. to plant churches there. Yeah. So what I think is done first and foremost is really change the course, the trajectory of the church in the U.S. to say, no, we're not going to die. And it's bringing fresh insight, new ways of worship, new ways of leadership, new ways of being church in this landscape. And so you go to a lot of these denominations, and where the growth is happening is in the immigrant churches. For example, back in about 10, 12 years ago, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ passed a vision plan with 4 priorities, which included to be an anti-racist, pro-reconciling denomination, to start 1,000 new congregations, to transform 1,000 existing congregations, and to support and train the leadership needed to be anti-racist, church planting, and church transforming. When you look at those numbers, we're 3/3 of the way there to 1,000 new congregations.
3/3?
Yeah, 3/4 of the way there.
I was going to say congratulations.
Yeah, well, I'm not a math major.
There you go.
3/4 of the way there.
That's great.
About 750 new churches, most of which are Hispanic, Asian, and Haitian congregations. And this is the new life of the church, which is going to change the DNA, the identity, the sort of core being of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Yeah. And when you talk about renewing established churches, the Disciples of Christ is a rather traditional church in the United States. And so how do churches go about? I mean, are these brand new churches with only Latinos, or are these churches that do a good job of kind of reconciling races and that kind of thing?
Repeat the question, I'm sorry.
Sure. Are these churches that you've talked about that are new, are Latinos and Haitians and immigrants the only members, or are these blended congregations?
You know, they tend to be, in the immigrant church, there's sort of a 2-tier or 2-step process. Most immigrant church begin as what I would call port of entry churches. Port of entry churches are basically almost carbon copy of the homeland. And so these churches serve as support for churches where the U.S. is brand new, strange land. This is all foreign to us. And the church becomes the place where not only your spiritual needs get met, but your cultural identity is cemented in a foreign land.
Yeah. You see family, you see friends, you have traditions that are honored back home, but perhaps not in the new place.
Right. And in many places, these churches serve as almost the cultural center of the community. And so it does the primary task of nurturing the soul, but also nurturing those cultural values and practices that inspire, that makes the people who they are. That's the first step. So then they stay here, and their kids are raised here. And so their kids become Americanized. They become second generation. In the Asian American church, they love this phrase, 1.5 generation, which is this generation that was born in the homeland, born in Korea, in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, but are raised here. And so then that starts to clash over against the port of entry church, and it starts to say, you know, this is good and dandy, but we're Filipino, but we're also American. We're Mexican, but we're also American. And so then what happens is you start to develop these second generation churches. I served one in Hammond, Indiana, that was, as I like to say, we worshiped, whether we worship in English or in Spanish, we always worship in Latino. Yeah. And what I mean by that is the flavor, the vibe, the vitality still had a very Hispanic flair to it, even though we were singing songs in English. Songs that you would hear at Willow Creek or at one of those mega churches, or songs you would hear at old hymn that you would hear from the old traditional church. But it was done with sort of a Hispanic flair. And people went there because the port of entry church was too port of entry. Yeah. But the Anglo church was too Anglo. And so now you have this sort of tier, and it's usually in those places where you start to see the multiculturality piece play a role. Yeah. Soong Chang Ra has written a lot about racism and multiculturality in the church. He is evangelical covenant denomination, and he talks about how the healthiest multicultural churches usually are led by second-generation immigrants. Because these are folks, like in my own personal experience, that know how to cross cultures every day. Because when you were at home, I was in a microcosm of Puerto Rico. But the second I stepped out the front door, it was a different culture. And so I learned cross-cultural abilities, being able to function inside the home and also inside the port of entry church, but also being able to function out in mainstream United States. Yeah. And so that's where you see the multiculturality happening. In my last church where I served in Hammond, we were predominantly Hispanic, but we had Anglo, we had African American, we had a Cherokee family, we had quite a few biracial couples. They're African American Hispanic, Korean Hispanic, Anglo Hispanic. And that's where the multicultural.
So when you talk about existing churches making home for new faces, the first might be just giving up space for a port of entry church, saying, look, you know, we realize that our songs, our music, our whatever may be very similar, but this is going to serve as a cultural center for you all. This is going to really be a you, us kind of deal. Whereas when you talk about second generation, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're talking about a group that's going to be relatively, and I've read some statistics that on second generation folk, a lot of them, you know, don't even know their parents' language and don't want to learn. That there's this sense that we want, this is our future, and so we want to plug into it. Yeah. And
in a prime example, we have an Anglo pastor in this region, a disciples pastor, who's learning Spanish. The entire neighborhood is Spanish, and he's the kind of guy to say, we need to do a second-generation church for those who have been here for a while, because there's second-generation success that lives in the neighborhood, as well as recent immigrants. And he saw a young Hispanic boy sitting in the steps of the church, and he said something to him in Spanish, and the kid responded in English. So that was my experience a lot of times, for example, with my dad, where my dad would say something to me in Spanish, and I would respond in English. And he understood me and I understood him. And so you have that sort of in-between place where they're afraid to speak the language of their mother and father, but they understand it. And so they'll hear it in Korean or in Hindi, but then responded in English.
So then there's a welcoming and there's a door open, if you will, towards second generations in terms of being a place of outreach or incorporation for existing congregations, as long as they're willing, as you mentioned, your friend the pastor is learning Spanish,
right,
willing to to reach out. I would also wonder, Jose, that when you come to America and you've perhaps had a different religious training or you've been exposed to a different form of religion, that there are certain preferences and that there are certain ways that a church needs to behave in order to become attractive to folk. In what ways is that true, and can you describe that?
Yeah, I think first of all, one of the pieces that need to be, I think, clear to folks is that there's an assumption, and I think Diane Eck makes this assumption to her peril. Now, I think she's done great work in the Religious Pluralism Project, which I think is an important one that we need to follow up on and really invest in. But they always give the story of the Shinto temple in, I want to say San Francisco, one of those places. And they make glories about the Shinto temple because it's the immigrant faith coming in. What that story doesn't tell you is that the Shinto temple is behind this enormous Chinese Presbyterian church. And so the first piece is a lot of the immigrants coming in are coming in as Christians, and Christians who have made Christianity their own. And so the expression is different. By and large, this is, without making overgeneralizations, more conservative expressions. And there's a piece to immigrant faith that's always going to be conservative, even for those of us like myself who consider myself a little bit more progressive, because you're trying to conserve something of the tradition you're coming from. The worship tends to be more charismatic, Pentecostal in feel. And so I think knowing those pieces about the stereotypical, again, and you have to go case by case by case, but the stereotypical immigrant church, I think that the church needs to really be able to understand that, appreciate that, even if they don't do it themselves. And so as they create space, one of the biggest issues, sounds really ridiculous to me, but has become an issue for Anglo churches that are nesting immigrant churches, is where are they going to put the drum set up in the chancel area? That's, talk about a cultural clash. Where the drums in one church, the nesting church, looks like almost an abomination to all that is right and pure in worship. To the immigrant church, it's an important part of the worship. It's
just as important as an organ.
That's right, if not more. And so one of the hesitations I have, I'm working with a church that will remain nameless, that's the immigrant church, we're trying to plant them in a congregation. And they're refusing to. They're meeting in homes because they said, every time we've nested, we've been treated like second-class citizens. We've been told this is what you can't do. These are the hours. Any extra minute you step over those hours, we're going to charge you. And if you put drums, don't put drums up there. Or if you do, you got to take them down every Sunday. You got to put them back and take them down, put them back and take them down. So I think a way for established churches to open themselves is to show a little liturgical flexibility and a little more appreciation about something that's different from theirs, but that is equally valid in the eyes of God. Well, in the eyes and in the ears of God. And so I think that sort of flexibility and being aware of privilege as well.
But before you get off that topic, I want to share with you, I heard this years ago, I don't know if it's true or not, Jose, but it's germane to what you were describing, that if you... the number one or the most central demarcator between a growing church and a non-growing church is the presence of drums in the sanctuary. I mean, I don't know if it's bongos, if it's timpani, if it's a drum set, but this person who was giving this conference, I don't know where he got the information, but I remember making note of it, that says something about the vibrancy, perhaps, the openness to new neighbors, as you're alluding to. But anyway, that's kind of an interruption to what you were saying, but greater liturgical flexibility, I think, is what you were enumerating for us. I think understanding, I think excellence is really what grows congregations. Now, that doesn't mean that you can never mess up. In fact, I think
some gracefulness in messing up is also vital for congregations and growth. But I think excellency, which means that for a Tongan congregation, excellency looks differently than for a Hispanic congregation. You know, those are very different examples of what excellency looks like. And so I think it really comes down to excellency. And then another E word, which I like to use when I travel across the region, expectation. And what I mean by that is, I grew up in a church. I grew up in a Pentecostal tradition. And as they say, you could take the man out the Pentecostal church, but you can't take the Pentecostal out the man. I consider myself a charismatic disciple. That's still in there. All the seminary in the world couldn't take that out of me. Right. You know, and I grew up where people would show up early and kneel at what they called the altar space. And they would pray to ready their hearts to meet God in this worship experience. We don't do that here. We sort of show up 5 minutes after it starts, watching our watch because we don't want to miss the opening kickoff. We have no expectation. We come at best to another E word that I don't like, to be entertained. And so there's no sense of expectation that the Spirit is present in this gathering, that God's going to move, that God's going to transform lives, that God's going to use song and prayer and sermon and table to encounter us, to transform us, so that then we can go out into the world and make a difference. And I think a lot of immigrant churches that are growing, they come with a sense of expectation. Jesus is in this gathering. The Spirit is being poured out in this gathering. God is ever present with us. And I think excellency and expectation are the two markers of growing congregations, regardless of the language they worship in, regardless of the culture they're from, regardless of whether there's drums or a pipe organ. I think when you have those pieces, you have healthy churches.
I'd like you to tease out excellence, because certainly there are places that have more liturgical and musical gifts than others, sure. and that certainly. I mean, because what comes to mind for me is not as much excellence as it is authenticity. That people are really looking to nourish, to worship in ways that are nourishing to them and that are authentic to them, and that may mean off-key singing every now and again. But I mean, I just wondered if you could speak to that nuance.
I think you spoke to it. I think by excellency, I mean something that's genuine to the community. Okay. A form of expression of worship that's not imposed on them, but that emerges from that body as something that's right and pure and holy. Yeah. So I'd be willing, because I like working with the E words. I won't give up excellency, but authenticity I think fits it just right. There's the sense in which this is pure and holy and wholesome. I grew up in this Pentecostal church where the musicians were excellent. Self-trained musicians, kids from 5 years old picking up drumsticks, learning how to play drums. And we always had enough musicians to go around. The singing could be off, and yet it was singing that came from within. There was a gentleman at that church. I mean, he couldn't carry a tune with a bucket. But every time he sang, the space was filled with a saturated presence of Spirit. And everyone knew it. This guy couldn't, I mean, this guy would wake up the dead with the horrible singing he did.
Really?
And yet, it was real. This was a guy who was considered mentally disabled by the world outside. And in the world within, he was given liturgical prominence. He was given a lead role. Whereas in the world, he was a ward of the state, somebody that needs to be cared for. Okay. And in the church, he was a leader. And he would sing from his gut, and it was awful singing. Yeah. Oh, I still remember, awful. Yeah. And yet, the space changed every time he sang. Yeah. And so I do think excellency doesn't mean that you bring in Blue Man Group to do the drumming of your church, or that you try to get the chamber orchestra of the town you're in to do the worship. It just means that it's done with authenticity and with pure heart and with with intentionality.
Okay. I want to step back a bit, because you're really giving us some good information in terms of what traditional congregations can do to welcome the new. And part of that, as you've alluded to, means if you're interested in a port of entry church, that you simply welcome in that way, and that you don't get mad if they put the drums on the altar. But if you really are interested in reaching out to those who are your new neighbors, I think a lot of congregations, mine is like that, where the neighborhood is totally different from the original founders who lived there.
Yeah.
You know, how do we begin to make those inroads and those welcomes?
Oh yeah, well, it's a both and. I think that privilege piece is always one. You know, what do you mean by that? Well, you know, the Anglo church that's nesting still keeps the morning slot, and the immigrant church is relegated to the afternoon slot. And what happens when the premium slot is 20 folks gathering around a piano, and the 1 p.m. slot is 200 folks busting at the seams? And still, those folks are still treated as second-class citizens, as tenants who help us get by so we can pay a part-time pastor. You know, there's something bad about that. That needs to be just named. And it's awful to hear. Nobody wants to hear it, but it needs to be named. I think that's the first piece. Privilege must be named, because it has, I mean, I go back to this church that we're helping. They don't want to deal with that again. They don't want to deal with it. It's been hurtful. It's been dehumanizing. It's been at times, you know, the chair goes loose. They blame the congregation. There's gum on the floor. They blame that congregation, and so this naming happens. So I think that's the first piece. The second piece is with the nesting congregation, which is not always hurting, but stereotypically, usually they open the doors when they're hurting. That's a part of it, isn't it? The reason that there are 20 people there and they're making room is often out of an economic, motive. That, you know, we want to keep the building, and, you know, we can't do it with 20 people, so you guys come in, but you've got to live by our rules, and we're going to pay more attention to the bricks and mortar than we are as to what the Spirit of God happens to be doing in terms of lighting hearts on fire for God. That's right. And so then you name the piece that there's two possibilities. One, you can open yourselves completely to this immigrant faith and take a mentoring position to say, what is this immigrant church doing right that maybe can help us revitalize? Right. We're always, the privilege doesn't let you see yourself as a mentoree, only as a mentor. And maybe that needs to change, and maybe there could be some vitality there. More of a partnership than a tenant landlord. Of a partnership and learning from each other. I think that the immigrant church can learn from the established church. I've been saying that to my, for example, Hispanic congregations since day one. You know, that even if there's only 20, the reason why there's still 20 and can afford a pastor is because structurally, administratively, in terms of funds, they're doing something right. Well, yeah, and if they've been there 80 years, you know, there's something, even though they may be dying on the vine, they've still been there 80 years. That's right, because the other piece sometimes you see in not just Hispanic churches, we also see them in non-denominational mega bursts, is that they go through this and then they're down to nothing. So there's something in the historic church that, you know, we've had disciples for over 200 years, which means disciples have done something right. We have Episcopalians for, if you count the Anglican predecessor, even before that, they're doing structurally, administratively something right that the immigrant church can learn from, and that can also they can also gift the immigrant church. But vice versa, there's something that the immigrant church is bringing that could bring new fire, new spark to the established church. So I think the first thing is that mentorship, and then the second one, which I think is also important, if there is, you know, we believe in a resurrected Christ, so I never give up. I never rule out resurrection. But sometimes existing churches need to die, and so also making space for a proper grieving, and a proper letting go, and a proper burial that can be a seed that gives new life. I think can also be something, and that takes. This is when my job as middle judicatory can come in to help a congregation die in a healthy way, so that their death is not a dead end, but a seed that gives, and the seed is in terms of the building, in terms of the money, in terms of their legacy, different ways in which they can bring forth new life.
Yeah, and walking, and it's nice to know that there are people like you who are on a staff who are helping congregations do that, because there's nothing wrong with saying mission accomplished.
Yeah.
You know, was it 7 churches that Paul planted in Revelation? They're all gone. You know, I mean, you know, and Paul was not a bad church planter. You know, you just you wonder about the natural, you know, flow of things. Is every church created to be there forever?
Yeah, well, Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Jesus did not mean that local congregation.
Right.
Church universal. And that church will manifest. I can't believe I'm quoting the Gaither Vocal Band, but I quote him here. And there was a live recording. You know, theologically, I don't always see eye to eye with the Gaither Vocal Band. Harmony-wise, I think they're fabulous. They sing amazing. And they did a song where one of the lead vocalists there said, you know, God will always have a witness in the world. And that may not mean that local congregation, but we can trust that God's always going to have witnesses in the world. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the best witness we can give is to die a faithful death. Mm-hmm. That would give birth to a new congregation. Yeah. And I don't think that means quitting right away, quitting before you give a fight. But I think having the courage to name the end of a congregation is something that's actually faithful and life-giving versus trying to drag on a dying congregation.
Yeah, and that's the hard part, isn't it? Is knowing when to fold them.
Yeah.
I can imagine in your experience, you know, you're up. I mean, you've got a congregation maybe with 20 members in your judicatory, and they're, you know, they love to keep meeting, and they love to have their supply minister come in, and they just feel like, well, we are doing good ministry, you know, and they don't yet want to face the economic realities that's going to end soon.
Yeah, it's hard, and some churches will drag on for as long as the money is around. Even if you try to counsel them and say, maybe you need to find a more creative use of your remaining resources. But it comes down to grief. It comes down, a lot of the older folks there want somebody to bury them.
Well, it also comes down to comfort, right? And which is what I think you're naming, is that, you know, and the gospel is by definition not comfortable.
Not at all. And the comforting pieces of it, when you turn the coin, there's a conviction that falls behind that. So come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest. That's right before pieces about being sent out and the suffering Messiah, and you following the suffering Messiah. So I mean, when I used to teach on pastoral care, one of the things I used to say, care is not the same as coddle. The reason why I'm visiting people in the hospital is to empower them to continue the mission they're called to do in the world.
So let's talk a little bit more about the welcoming that existing congregations can do. And you've talked about mostly port of entry churches, because if you're making room for them to use your space, you're not trying to incorporate them into your congregation.
Right.
Where second generation, or reaching out to second generations, then becomes really important, because there can be a lot of second generation people around.
Yeah, and usually there's different ways to do that. I mean, there's second generation leadership that feels a call to do that. I have a Korean friend out in the Bay Area, California, who's doing that intentionally. Sometimes it happens organically out of a port of entry church. So either the port of entry church becomes a second generation church, or the port of entry church facilitates the funding and the founding of a second generation church. It's rare that comes out of an Anglo congregation seeing second generation success and facilitating that. You still need some port of entry juices to start the second generation church. So it usually comes out either organically or intentionally from a port of entry church, sometimes with the help of middle judicatory and their new church funds and things of that nature.
And so then, but welcoming a second generation, immigrant families to an existing church may be something that is possible versus welcoming a first generation.
Yeah, that's always possible. It's always tricky. With the one church that I'm working with that sees the need for both port of entry and second generation, the one advice I gave, and Soong Chang Rao, who I quoted earlier, also concurs, is the leadership must reflect the future that the church is trying to grow into. So if you have an all Anglo staff and you're saying we're welcoming second generation folks, there's something disingenuous and inauthentic about it. That there really needs to be some intentional leadership piece that happens there.
Are you giving me a timeout?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, good. Sorry.
Oh no, there are no timeouts in this interview. You got to say something. You go ahead. That's okay.
Yeah.
Are we
cool? No. I was just, we had company, so I wanted to...
Oh no, hey, listen, no problem. We've had all kinds of stuff on this show. So what you're saying is the leadership reflecting where the church is going to go. I think that's a really significant point. That if you're really intentional about including the neighborhood that has changed, make sure that in your leadership you are welcoming and you are affirming of. And does that just go for ethnic, or does that also go for age?
Oh, it goes for age. I mean, it goes for age, ethnicity, a slew of things. That the leadership should reflect the direction you want to go. That's the best way. I mean, there's a reason why, in order to start a healthy congregation, in order to transform a healthy congregation, or transform a congregation into a healthy congregation, in both of those cases, you need strong leadership. And strong leadership is not the antithesis of facilitating lay leadership. People have this big thing that you're either a dictator or a facilitating leader. That's a false dichotomy. If you look at the best grassroots organizations, and I did grassroots organizing in Northwest Indiana, in impoverished Hammond and Gary, Indiana, you have very strong leadership, but you also have an empowerment of the people. And I think it starts with the leadership. I mean, if you want to be the church of tomorrow, then you need to start changing the culture and the structure to reflect the direction you're going. Don't say, well, let's change all this stuff and then we'll change it. No, start with the structure. Start with the cultural changes that are going to happen in the life of the congregation. Be up here. Now, that's going to upset some people, but it's also going to open new inroads for new vitality.
Okay. So you begin to see the neighborhood changing. You begin to want to reach out, and perhaps a couple people come. And I would guess this would take some time, because you don't make somebody a leader right away. I would guess that would be difficult if they didn't want to do it.
Yeah, that's the trick, and each church has its way of calling and developing leaders. And I think what I would just say with that is having a cultural intelligence of other cultures, to say those cultures look for different pieces, different markers of leadership. And so expanding the lens through which you see the leader. Things like wisdom, the word wise, was always used when describing a good pastor in the Port of Entry church where I grew up. Administration was barely ever mentioned as the sign of a good leader. That a good leader was wise. That a good leader had deep spirituality. And so you start to really learn from other folks for different markers of healthy, strong leadership. And so being able to expand from what you normally, your checklist of this is what we need of our leaders, maybe develop a relationship with a Port of Entry pastor to say, what do you consider to be a healthy leader? And then going back to your own little checklist and changing that. Because sometimes we get an Anglo mold of a leader and try to fit a Korean pastor into it. Well, that's just not fair. That's just, well, that person has no finance experience. Well, maybe that's not a piece that's important to that tradition. Maybe it is. I mean, not making any assumptions here. but really being very, there needs to be a growth in cultural intelligence and cross-cultural intelligence that goes beyond the language, goes way beyond the language. A lot of people say, well, if I learn the Spanish, I'm good to go. No, you need to learn the mannerisms. You need to learn the expectations. You need to learn the embedded structures and practices. You need to learn the food, which sometimes is a fun endeavor to do, in order to really be not bilingual, but bicultural.
And around all that, though, isn't the more important or just as important this aspect of love? Because no matter how much we try to be and understand somebody, it all comes down to accepting people and loving them where they are, whether or not you speak the language or not, because isn't love that language that kind of covers it?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. But as we all know, love is easier said than love requires, as we learn from the cross event, a bit of self-sacrifice that we're not always willing to do.
Absolutely. I want to ask you, as you do your traveling, and you do a lot of it, around the church, you said that one of the energizing things that you see is immigrants in worship, and this sense that there's a rejuvenation happening. What are some of the challenges that you're just having to, that you're seeing over and over again?
Within the immigrant communities, or with the church at large?
The church in general. As it pertains to your particular interest, which is the spiritual vitality of immigrants.
Oh, sure. I think it starts there, actually. I think it starts with that. I think the biggest problem, you mentioned it, was getting comfortable and getting settled. In the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and in our region, we have three stages of a congregation from birth. We started as a mission project, and then the mission project gets called, when it moves from that to congregation and formation, and then finally when it's reached its point, it's called established congregation. That's awful. I can't stand the term established congregation. A dying congregation is an established congregation. A healthy congregation is always a congregation in formation. Is always a congregation on a journey. Is always a congregation that's already here and not yet. That sort of eschatological reality. And so for me, I think the biggest hurdle is this sense in which no church should ever settle. No church should ever say we've arrived. And that's a problem with port of entry churches, with second-generation churches, with mega churches, with established congregation, this sense in which we arrived. I remember hearing a few years back a preacher, he was doing one of the Exodus texts, one of the wilderness wandering passages. And the key point he said is that the journey is our home. We are a journey people. And so I think that's the first piece. I think the second piece revolves around busyness. We live in that Protestant capitalist ethic that says the more we do, the more we are. And I like to take a cue card from that great modernist architect from Chicago, Mies van der Rohe, who said less is more. I think churches sometimes get stuck on this sense in which we've got to have all these projects going at the same time in order for us to be vital. No. You could do 3 things and do them well. Now, I think one of them is a non-negotiable. I think the church worships. So whatever happens, the church must worship. 2, the church must make disciples, which is education, but it also mission falls into that. Mentorship falls into that. Different ways to form the spirit, the mind, the hands of disciples. Develop holy habits that empower them for mission. And then obviously a major piece is what you do outside the 4 walls. And that could be, we can't do everything, but we're going to do a food pantry, or we're going to do tutoring because we're right across the street from a high school, or an elementary school or what have you, or we're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to support the low-income community right around the corner. And you can do those three things and do them really well, and not feel like, well, we're not doing much. Well, in terms of numbers, in terms of number of programs, you may not be doing much. But in terms of debt, you may be doing a lot. So I think busyness gets in the way, not just of churches, but of individual Christians. I mean, we busy ourselves to death, so we don't have any prayer time. We don't have any time to soak in the Word, to read Scripture, to take holy pauses, to have a Sabbath day. We just busied ourselves to death. And I think busyness is killing spirit. And I think we just have to let go of some stuff and say with the modernist architects that less is in fact more. So we have to do very little and do a lot.
What are you up to now? What are you mentioned that your denomination had embarked upon this rather ambitious plant 1,000 churches, reform or reinvigorate 1,000 churches. What's taken your passion these days?
Oh, transformation. I mean, and new church. And so, really, I think my position, which is regional minister, used to be two positions. It used to be a state secretary and a state evangelist. Now, that E word scares some mainliners.
Yeah, you like the E words, though. We've already established that.
Yeah, no, I'm an E guy. I mean, all the way. And what I've noticed, with no disrespect to my colleagues, there's always been a leaning towards state secretary, almost at the expense of state evangelist. And so I've decided to lead with the other foot. I decided to be an evangelist first and a secretary second. And so for me, evangelist, when you think of evangelist, I always think of new faith, that is bringing people to Christ, starting new congregations, those sorts of things, and renewed faith. So that old stale faith, oh, well, I was baptized, I was born again back in the 60s. Well, if that's the only story of your journey that you're still sharing, then there needs to be some renewed faith happening. So I've really gone around the region, not preaching company sermons. Well, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, has passed this resolution and is doing this. I have preached the text in such a way that inspires people to join the journey, and people to re-inspect their lives in such a way that gives them a revitalized view of being a disciple of Jesus. And so for me, that's been my passion. So how do we have the hard conversation of saying, the church, sitting with the church recently and say, the structure you have, coupled with the culture you have, a culture that says in order for anything to get done, we need to pay somebody for that position. And a church that's shrinking, can't keep paying for these little positions, is going to bring to your eventual demise. Now, they didn't want to hear that. Of course they didn't want to hear that, but they needed to hear that. So you need to change culture, you need to change structure, and have a renewed sense of mission. And this was also a church that did a bunch of projects. Scratch most of those. You're not doing them well anyways. Do 3 and do them well. And so really inspiring that. And then also just building these relationships. Right now we're considering a new church start in Wyoming. So bringing the existing Wyoming congregations into a new relationship where they get a sense of ownership of that new congregation in Wyoming. So to help start with fund with leadership, fund with money, with whatever ways that they, with raw materials. So we got a drum set, we got a guitar, we got hymnals, we got whatever to help. So having this sort of group approach to starting new congregation.
How do you
speaking with the Hispanic leadership that's existing to say we need more Hispanic churches. Telling them, hey, which are your key leaders that you can give us to fund this new church? And they've been very receptive.
How do you go about identifying? I mean, in the community, I mean, I would imagine that you say that a lot of these new churches are coming from immigrant communities. How do you go about identifying groups, that are out there meeting, worshiping, and say, oh, do you want to be a Disciples of Christ church? I mean, how does that?
It's both and. I mean, I've kind of got lucky. So we've got a Tongan congregation that
Tongan, so they're from Tonga.
Yeah, they're from Tonga. They may join. Well, they've been nesting in the Disciples Church for who knows how long. And they like it. I mean, the Disciples' ethos is something that they find attractive. Now, they may stay where they're at, but, you know, I've been lucky. They've come to us.
Now, what's Tongan spirituality like?
Oh, they love to sing. Like Samoan culture, don't tell them they're the same, but Samoan and Tongan cultures both have this beautiful, rich harmony, chant / singing.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess what I'm getting to is it Pentecostal? Is it National Church of Tonga? Is it? I mean, I'm just thinking that, you know, if there are churches that are meeting in a neighborhood, the theology and traditional expression of the faith may be so different than what a European established church might offer that may make it difficult.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, Tongans, stereotypically, if you're a Christian Tongan, you're Wesleyan / Methodist. That's what you are. And so, actually, they're very Wesleyan in their theology, which they share with Anglo-Wesleyans. A lot of Koreans, even if they're charismatic in their worship, at the end of the day, they're Calvinists till the cows come home. I mean, they're Calvinists. And sometimes they're the defenders of classical Calvinism, whereas you've got a lot of liberal Presbyterians that are kind of like, slow down on the Calvin talk, or only picking the parts of Calvin that really appeal to them. You've got Koreans defending what was labeled as white Calvinism, defending that because that's who they are. So I think it just depends community to community. And I think with Hispanics, for example, even the ones who are anti-Catholic Protestants still have a bit of Catholic in them, whether they want to admit it or not, because it's in the water, it's in the air. And so I think it just depends congregation to congregation. And I think in some cases, I think the established church is missing a connection that's already there. For example, with the Tongan community, I'm surprised that United Methodist, and I don't know, you know, that's for me a port of an avenue of conversation with the Tongan communities to say, this is something we share. Could we build on this sharing to grow our respective communities?
So anyway, I guess I was back to that question of how you find in your community other worship communities that are perhaps searching for an affiliation.
You know, the formal way is, in our denomination, we have a sort of new church office in Indianapolis that has a wonderful demographic program called Mission Insight, which slices numbers in ways you didn't know numbers could be sliced. That's the formal way. The informal way is the locals. We're talking about this church chart in Gillette. We don't know if we can get it off the ground. We need some money to help it start it. We need some pastoral leadership. We're still trying to figure out that piece. But you know, part of it was just the pastor in Sheridan saying, "I've been to Gillette a bunch of times, and it's growing, and Hispanics are growing there too." So I mean, it's just sort of hunch readings, which are not as scientific as our modernist sensibilities that are still with us, whether we like it or not, would like. But I think hunch works. And then the José Morales method. And I'm going to give you this one for free. The next one's going to cost you. Look at the restaurants that are in the area, and then go inside the restaurants to see who's eating in them. And then go to the local Walmart or Target and see who's shopping. It's that simple. And then when you look at that, you say, wow, there's Ethiopians here. And one of my aspirations is to get an Ethiopian disciples congregation going in Denver. Being that the second largest Ethiopian diaspora after D.C., the largest is in Denver metro area. You know, and I knew that before I ever touched the demographic study. I knew that because I went to the Family Dollar and just walked around, see who was shopping. And I went to the big supermarket and I say, who's walking in here? And that's how you figure that things out. You look at the vending places that sell halal meat, so you know this is a Middle Eastern community here, or kosher meat. You know, there's a lot of Jewish presence here. So that's how you figure all that stuff out.
You know, as we wrap it up, Jose, I always like to ask, is there anything that you came to the interview that you wanted to say that I haven't given you time to say, or is there something that's perhaps on your heart as our audience of Christian leaders are attentive to what you have to say about this important subject?
Sure. Yeah, one of my stump speeches is that structure is not in place to nurture structure. Mm-hmm. Structure is in place to nurture mission. Buildings are built not to nurture more building, but to nurture mission. Pastors are placed not for the sake of job security, but for the sake to inspire leadership within their community. And for me, I always think we need to put that. We've got this crisis in shrinking mainline churches where the conversation is around how do we preserve the structures we have in place. That's awful. There's nothing gospel about that. The conversation should be is, we Methodists, we Presbyterians, we Baptists have really something beautiful to offer the world. And I believe that. I'm an ecumenical guy. God knows we need Pentecostals. God knows we need Orthodox. Yeah. God knows we need all those folks around. And how do we preserve that mission that we're trying to do? Yeah. Whatever the structure looks like. And if that means shrinking the structure into a third and a bunch of people having to find new ways to serve the church, that's a hard thing to do, but it needs to be done. Because we're not trying to preserve structure. We're trying to preserve the mission that we're doing.
Jose Morales with the Disciples of Christ, thanks for joining me on Church Next.
Thank you. Blessing.